Welcome, everybody. I'm Martha Shapiro. I'm the Director of Programs at Senior Concerns, and welcome to our Legal Education Seminar Series. We're really pleased to be able to put this seminar series together for you on a variety of different legal topics that affect older adults and family caregivers in the community. We'll be holding them once a month, so please go to our website, seniorconcerns.org, under seminars, so that you can see all of our upcoming topics and register for them as they come up. And now we will go ahead and get started with today's topic, which is all about elder abuse, really what we all need to know as part of our community to help keep our older adults and our dependent adults safe and cared for. And I'm really excited to have these two fabulous speakers with us today. First, you'll be hearing from Carrie Aldaba, who is the Program Manager of Ventura County Adult Protective Services. She holds a Master's of Science degree in gerontology and has 24 years of professional social work experience. Hard to imagine that you started when you were 10. She's enjoyed working with elders and is passionate about educating the community on elder abuse and its prevention, and would like to continue making strides in the field to eliminate elder abuse, as well as contribute to public policies that strengthen existing elder abuse laws. She believes the wisdom that can be gleaned from elders is priceless in helping to advance the next generation, and one of the greatest honors in life is to give back to vulnerable elders in the community by providing a voice for those who cannot speak for themselves. That is beautifully said. And then we'll hear from Alexa Leibel, who is the Elder and Dependent Adult Abuse Prosecutor with the Ventura County District Attorney's Office. Ms. Leibel reviews, files, and prosecutes the majority of cases involving elder and dependent adult victims. She has been a prosecutor for 6.5 years and conducted 30 jury trials involving a variety of crimes. Ms. Leibel has authored and co-authored 7 publications for the California District Attorneys Association involving topics including prosecuting sex offenders, motions to suppress diversion and domestic violence probation terms, among others. So thank you both so much for being with us today, and I will start by turning it over to Carrie.
Thanks so much, Martha. I'm going to go ahead and pull up my PowerPoint presentation so that everybody can see the slides as I'm speaking. Thanks so much for having me today. It's such a privilege to be able to speak to all of you about this really important topic. My goal today is just to give you a basic overview of the Adult Protective Services Program and to answer any questions that you may have about APS or just about elder abuse in general and kind of what we're seeing out in the community or at the state level. So I think probably most of you in the audience have heard of Adult Protective Services since you're participating in this webinar. But our program differs from a lot of the other county programs that are available, including the child welfare program. So obviously our population is, some of you may not be aware that the law changed last year in 2022, that an elder is now considered 60 for APS. I don't know about you, but as I am aging myself, that seems awfully young. But the goal of the state doing that was kind of 2 different reasons. One is a lot of programs for older adults, federal programs, are age 60 and older. So they wanted to be more in alignment with that. And then also, they wanted to give APS programs in California an opportunity to intervene sooner, where we might still be able to make a difference before it's too late for somebody who's currently being abused. And so therefore, since the elder age changed, that dependent adult age changed too. And now a dependent adult in APS in California is an adult between the ages of 18 and 59 years old. Again, pretty young. But we're still seeing any adult over 18 essentially that is unable to care for themselves or make their own decisions. Our program is a state mandated program. We're codified into law. They can't eliminate our program because of a budget. The law would have to change at the state level to eliminate our program. So we're codified into law, and we're a 24-hour program. Some of you listening may not be aware that we have an after hours component to our program for emergency. So law enforcement officers are able to call after hours if they find maybe an adult wandering at night, or maybe somebody's being abused at night by their caregiver. They're able to contact us at night, and we do have one social worker and one supervisor on call at all times in the evening. So We are a 24-hour program. Obviously, there's no cost for someone to participate in our program. Our program is funded by a lot of different means: the state, the county, general fund, and some federal dollars. So it's kind of a combination of all of those funding streams, but there is no cost to the elder to participate in our program. We charge no money to come assist people and help people. And likewise, there is no income requirement like there is in other programs. You don't have to make a certain amount of money. You don't have to even have legal status to be in our program. So we'll see anybody. We've seen millionaires, and then we see people who have no income. So it's not a determining factor in whether we assign a case or not. The biggest piece I'd like to highlight is that APS is a voluntary program. And what I mean by that is that our clients have the right to tell us no to our services. Adults have the right to self-determine. It's written in the Constitution for that. So when we go out and we interact with an elder, they have the right to turn us away. In Ventura County, our best practice that differs from other counties is that we'll go a second time. The reason we do that is because we come unannounced, and the elder really doesn't have the opportunity to really appreciate why we're there. We're kind of blindsiding them, if you will, with our visit. And so if they don't want to see us that day, by all means, we'll maybe give them our business card and a pamphlet and say, you know what, why don't you think it over? We'll go ahead and come back next week. And then we give them one more opportunity and say, you know, Mr. Smith, Mrs. Jones, have you reconsidered? Would you just give us a few minutes to talk with you? Let us see how we might be able to assist you. And then if they refuse us the second time, then we're going to respect their wishes and we're going to close the case. But we want to give them at least one more opportunity to accept a visit from APS. On the third slide, I've already kind of covered what the population, the ages are, so I won't review that again. These are the types of abuse that really APS is investigating and that gets referred to us. As you can see, it's a host of things, almost pretty much anything you can really think of. Lots of different types of abuse. The most prominent ones that we see reported to us, self-neglect is definitely the top. And that really changed after COVID. For about 7 years in a row, it used to be financial abuse. That's kind of gone down to number 2. I truly believe it, you know, it's kind of what we're seeing post-pandemic. A lot of folks not getting their medical care, and we're just seeing kind of a decline, a medical decline in folks because of a delay in care and other factors too, being isolated from people and so on and so forth. So self-neglect is typically the first, the number 1 type of abuse reported to APS. Financial abuse is a close second. And then I would say third is probably neglect by their caregivers are taking advantage of them and not providing care, or they may be a well-meaning spouse who just isn't really up to the task anymore of providing the care, and then we're trying to educate that person. Or it could be a family member who means well, but really they're just not trained in how to provide the level of care that person requires, and then we're trying to connect them to resources. I will say we're seeing kind of an uptick in physical abuse, which is really concerning. We've seen a lot of those referrals lately. I'm sure Alexa could speak to that, but that's not something that we've seen before. I'm not sure if that just speaks to the times and difficult economics and different things that are making people angry, but that's definitely a big concern as far as a trend that we've been seeing in the last couple of months. So I thought I'd highlight that as well. When we're doing our abuse investigations, these are some of the signs listed here that we're really looking for, because when we're working with law enforcement in reporting to law enforcement the abuse that we're seeing, we really have to provide them evidence. They need evidence. Their standard is reasonable doubt, which I'm sure Alexa will cover in her presentation. So it's kind of incumbent upon APS to get as much information and evidence as possible to hand off to law enforcement so that they can determine whether there's enough to open an investigation, a criminal investigation. So physical abuse, you know, we're looking for different sorts of evidence: bodily injury, injuries that the client really can't explain. You know, if they're saying that they fell and the bruising is, you know, kind of on their, you know, thigh or something, that might not make sense. So we're looking for stories that sort of make sense, that would explain an injury. Especially with bruising, as I'm sure you're aware, a lot of medications, a side effect could be bruising, blood thinners and so forth. So we're looking more for like patterns of bruising. Maybe they were grabbed roughly around the wrist or choked around the neck or in the neck area, or maybe possibly in the groin area if there's maybe some sort of, you know, sexual abuse happening. So we're looking for those different signs of evidence of physical abuse. Some of the types of evidence that we're looking for with neglect A lot of them are decubitus ulcers. Maybe they're not being turned properly. So they're getting ulcers on their buttocks area, maybe their back, different places. If they look malnourished or if they're dehydrated, maybe their medication, they should have a 30-day supply, but maybe they're down, to 10 pills and it's just a week ago. Maybe they're being over-medicated to keep them compliant and easy to manage. Or likewise, the elder themselves is not taking their medication and they've got 3 months worth of medication sitting there, which is an indicator that they're not taking any of their medication. So looking for all those signs. Financial abuse, some things that obviously you would consider, maybe a pattern in their spending that's very unusual for that person. We've seen cases where the bank knows this person very well. They've been a customer for years, very frugal. All of a sudden, thousands of dollars are going out of the account, and that's very unlike the customer. And so that's kind of a red flag, if you will. And then obviously another big thing that we see too is I call it the dueling powers of attorney. There's a power of attorney established, and then someone comes along and maybe rescinds that and instates another power of attorney, and they're kind of battling over control of the elder dependent adult. So those types of things, documents, trusts, wills, changes in bank activity, those sorts of things. Isolation. This one we normally see reported to us when maybe a friend or a loved one from out of the area, they're trying to get in touch with the elder or dependent adult, they're calling, or maybe they're sending cards. All of the contact is either going unanswered, they can't get them on the phone, they're coming in person, no one's coming to the door, or they've got kind of a gatekeeper, if you will. There's someone that's saying, mom's sleeping, mom doesn't want to talk to you. Someone that's kind of making excuses about why mom or dad or grandma or grandpa doesn't want to see that person. So that's also a red flag that would trigger a report for abuse to APS. Okay, so unfortunately, with our population aging the way it is, we are seeing more reports of elder abuse coming. And what we do know is that elder abuse is often unreported anyways. And what the statistics tell us is that about 1 in 10 Americans are the victims of elder abuse. Ventura County is a pretty graying and older county relative to California. So we had almost 5,200 reports of elder abuse last year, and I can certainly tell you that we're on pace to surpass that by quite a bit this year already. We're a little over midway through the year. So unfortunately, we're staying quite busy, and our reports of abuse are increasing. Those are the trends. What I'd like to talk about next is what happens when you make a report to APS. So we have 10 calendar days to respond to a report by law. So when we get a report, we go unannounced. There's many reasons that we do this. One is that we don't really want to tip off the elder or maybe the suspected abuser that we're coming. If the elder is having trouble maintaining their hygiene, we don't want to alert them we're coming so that they take a nice shower that day and look nice and clean and say, there's no problem here. I'm great. I'm doing just fine. So we really want to meet people where they're at. We want to kind of see people in their own environment, get the lay of the land, see if what they're really struggling with and what they're capable of doing on their own, so that we can better assess how we can best link them to the needed supports available in the community. So as you can imagine, coming unannounced is quite upsetting to many people. They feel it's very rude that you don't make an appointment. So by all means, if that's upsetting to our clients, then we will absolutely make a time to come back at their convenience. It doesn't even have to be their home if they're not comfortable for us meeting in their home. We've had plenty of clients at libraries, parks, other relative or friends' homes. So we can definitely meet the elder at any place and time of their choosing. So we'll make every effort to accommodate their needs and their wishes in that regard. Sometimes they also want an advocate present with them that makes them feel comfortable. That's perfectly fine if that's what they want to do. So we make every effort to accommodate them. Sometimes the clients don't want to see us the first visit, like I mentioned earlier. So we'll try and come back a second time. The goal is really to persuade the client to let us talk with them so that we can kind of conduct a needs assessment. We're looking at all of their biological issues. What are their diagnoses? What medications do they take? Are they in contact with a regular medical provider? Those sorts of things. What's their mobility like? Are they having falls? Do they use an assisted device? Are they independent? Do they have a care provider? What are their strengths and what are they requiring assistance with to be safer in their home? We're looking at their social support systems. Do they have healthy support systems in place? Family, friends, community activities, civic engagement, those types of things for health and well-being. And then we're looking at their psychological functioning. Are they struggling with depression or anxiety? Are they having some cognitive changes? In APS, we use the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. It's a real quick 10-minute screening tool. And if the client participates, what that helps us to determine is whether the client is struggling with any cognitive impairment. So, cognitive impairments range, from 0 to severe. So that helps us to kind of determine if the client is struggling in those areas. And what we like to tell the clients is, by participating in this is information you can share with your doctor that helps your doctor be more well-informed about your condition and what supports you might require to stay independent. What we know is that cognition is key to retaining independence so that clients can make decisions, they can be informed, and they can plan for their future. So it's really important, and we want to help our clients with cognitive challenges get the supports that they need so that they can do that. So if we're successful in completing an assessment, then at that point, we're going to try to complete a service plan with that client to determine what kinds of supports that would be beneficial to them. So if a client is struggling with personal care or keeping up their home, we're going to maybe make recommendations for caregivers. Maybe that's private paid care. Maybe that's in-home supportive services, which is a Medi-Cal program that our county administers. Maybe it's a combination of private caregiving services and family support. So we're looking at kind of what makes most sense for the older adult, and then what can they afford? What is their support system like? Those sorts of things. And then we're kind of monitoring the case every 30 days to see if the service plan is functioning well. Do we need to make any adjustments? And then ultimately, we're going to be closing the case probably between 30 and 90 days. APS is a short-term crisis intervention program. So our goal is to get in, investigate the elder abuse, connect the older adult to needed services, and then close the case. So we're short-term. We work very quickly, and then we want to hand the elder off to long-term caregiving supports or social supports that are available in the community. Something to keep in mind, if you do make a report to APS, whether you're a mandated reporter or not, your reporting party identity is confidential. That is usually the first thing that the older adult wants to know. Who reported me, or who told on me, or some kind of variation of that. And we all have different ways of managing that, but the bottom line is we'll never disclose your identity to clients. They can guess all they want, but we don't confirm any of that. So a successful strategy that I used years ago when I was in the field, I would kind of turn the tables a little bit, and I would tell them, well, anyone can make a report, it's confidential. Do you know anyone that's been worried about you? And then they said, well, my doctor, or it might be my nosy neighbor, or my kids, so that it kind of redirects the conversation away from that topic. And I'll just tell them, let's go ahead and go on inside and let's talk about how you're doing. And you can tell me, about what your needs might look like. So the goal is to kind of redirect them away from the topic of who the reporting party is. Kind of a caveat of this too is that the case information likewise is also confidential. Sometimes reporting parties will call us back and they'll just say, hey, I made a report on Mrs. Jones. I just want to check. Do you think she's doing okay? And we won't be able to disclose any details without the client's permission. That's to protect their privacy and their information. So if they give us permission, we'll talk with whomever they give us permission to speak with. But otherwise, it is considered confidential information. Something that's really important to remember when working with adults is that the adults do have the right to self-determination. They can tell us no. They have the right to make choices, even choices that you and I might consider bad choices. So that's just something that we understand in working with adults. And sometimes it's like it's harm reduction is the focus. We might want to accomplish 5 things. Maybe the older adult says, I only want to do number 1 and 2. I don't want to do numbers 3, 4, and 5. So we have to work with them where they're at and what they're willing, to do for themselves. And then maybe the next time we see them, we can work on numbers 3 and 4. So it's kind of it's a patient process, and sometimes it means working with adults over the course of years in order to make a little bit of headway, and where they're ready to really accept the issue as a problem and accept wanting some support to kind of resolve that problem. The other goal of APS, it's really paramount. We want to keep clients in the least restrictive environment possible. For almost all adults, that would be their own homes. We try our very best to try and support older adults in their own homes. That's where most everybody wants to remain. In some instances, it's just simply not possible. We've had cases, for example, the client, because of their cognitive changes, they can't keep a caregiver in their home. They're constantly firing somebody. And so sometimes in a scenario like that, the least restrictive environment might be a boarding care, a home-like environment, but yet they're not in control of hiring and firing the caregivers. They're getting the support that they need. So it really depends on kind of the elder's circumstances or the dependent adult circumstances, but we always strive to keep the older adult or dependent adult in their own home, because that's typically where they're most comfortable and happy, is in their own home. So in conclusion, I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of our partners that help us do our very important work. We definitely can't do our work in a silo or a vacuum. We rely on our very important community partners like Senior Concerns and like other agencies as well that help us to do our work. So some of our common partners that we work with: victim services, they're at the DA's office helping us get those very important restraining orders when there's an active abuser in their lives. Law enforcement, they're the ones that are responsible for conducting the criminal investigations. We're just the vehicle to get them that information that they may not be aware of. So they're responsible for that. Public health, we're so fortunate in our county because not every APS program in California has public health nurses, but we have 3, and we're recruiting for a 4th. So we've got 3 wonderful nurses that are co-located in APS with us in our office, and they're there to see our clients that are having medical challenges. Some of our clients haven't seen doctors in years, so our nurses can do a basic health assessment and try to reestablish a medical home for our clients. They can give them education about their disease process, diabetes, high blood pressure, cholesterol, whatever their medical circumstances might be. And they're a great liaison with medical personnel. They speak the same language, so they can really be good communicators with doctors' offices and trying to get home health involved and other medical interventions so that the client's health circumstances improve. The regional center, there are close partners that work with dependent adults and provide long-term case management for those folks. We also have 2 active multidisciplinary teams in our county. So these are teams of expert consultants that meet regularly to kind of triage and problem solve difficult abuse issues that are facing our clients. So our financial abuse specialist team, known as FAST for short, that meets monthly, and it has a host of partners. Some are retired IRS agents, attorneys, insurance brokers, and the like that can kind of speak to the different financial abuse issues facing our clients and give our social workers recommendations to kind of move that case hopefully towards a resolution. And our other team is called the Rapid Response Expert Team. That's a team that APS facilitates, and we have a lot of community partners similar to the ones in the FAST, but we also have a local hospital. We have a real estate broker that we added to our team a couple of years ago. Behavioral health sits on our team, public health. Just again, a team of experts that can help our social workers hopefully find ways to eliminate or reduce the protective issues facing our clients. One of our most important partners is the district attorney's office. So this is a really good spot to hand it off to my valued partner, Alexa Leibel, to give her presentation.
Thank you, I appreciate that. I'll start by sharing my slides. Give me a moment here because this is one of the toughest parts of presenting the technology. Let's see. All right. Hopefully everyone can see my slides. Let's see here. All right, there we go. Thank you so much, Carrie, for the introduction, and thank you for your patience with my lack of technological abilities here. I'm really privileged to be speaking to all of you. I'm really grateful for this opportunity, and also grateful that this topic is being highlighted, because this topic, elder and dependent adult abuse, is something that's so often overlooked in our community. It's something that is really coming to the forefront now, though, because there is so much elder and dependent adult abuse that is being reported. We're seeing way higher rates of reporting than we've ever seen in the past. And we're seeing much more serious cases than common cases that have come in the past, which is a good thing because we see that people are reporting it. We see that people understand the importance of it. And so now we're going to take an opportunity really to talk about the district attorney's office and how we're involved. Our district attorney is Mr. Nazarenko, and my name again is Alexa Leibel. I handle the elder and dependent adult cases in Ventura County. So just a brief overview of our office. These numbers are always fluctuating, but I guess when I put this presentation together, we probably had about 106 prosecutors, approximately 50 DA investigators. Those are all sworn law enforcement officers who previously worked in a different law enforcement agency. Some are local agencies like the Sheriff's Department, VPD. Some come from out of county. We have some from Santa Barbara PD. We have some from Northern California. And those sworn DA investigators assist at all different levels of the investigation, and they also assist our office with other important matters. We also have about 34 victim advocates. The victim advocates are pivotal, especially in domestic violence and elder abuse. They're pivotal in helping these victims navigate the system and also helping connect them with resources that sometimes the district attorneys aren't involved in, and I'll get to that a little bit later in my presentation. Within our office, we have different units. For example, one unit is the misdemeanor unit. They handle all general misdemeanor cases. There are specialized units that generally focus on the type of crime or the victim. So my unit is the elder and dependent adult unit. My unit, again, is a specialized unit. And I'm involved in reviewing cases, filing and prosecuting cases, and all of these are victim-centered. So in other words, any crime that is committed against an elderly person or a dependent adult, that falls under the elder and dependent adult abuse unit. And that case will come to me or one of my colleagues, and we will review that case. And when I say when it comes in, generally it's a police report that comes in. We take a look at that police report and we determine whether or not we can file criminal charges. So here's a non-exhaustive list, believe it or not, of the crimes that constitute elder abuse. Essentially, elder abuse can be anything because it really depends on the victim. It can be, if you look on the bottom, even attempted murder can be elder abuse if the victim is an elder. Or there is a series of crimes that we refer to as elder abuse because there's a specific penal code section that codifies crimes specifically related to elders. And I'll get there in a little while as well. All right, so just to touch on our victims assistance unit, because they're such an integral part to what our office does. And a lot of the times people don't know that we have this unit within our office. Our victim advocates provide court support to victims throughout the process. Even before cases are filed, they can be involved and help victims through the process. Our victim advocates also do a lot of outreach and community presentations, and our specially assigned elder abuse victim advocates are especially active in the community in doing community presentations. One thing that our victim advocates love to do is give presentations on prevention of fraud, because fraud is such a prevalent issue these days, and with a little bit of education, we can prevent a lot of fraud, a lot of victimization of elderly people who are defrauded by people that target them. Our victim advocates also assist victims in obtaining criminal protective orders and restraining orders. And just to explain that portion of the slide, criminal protective orders are essentially restraining orders that are attached to criminal cases. So when a criminal case is filed, I can ask a judge to issue this criminal protective order. It's essentially a restraining order. But there are also a different type of restraining order that can be filed and they're not attached to the criminal case. Our family justice centers, we now have 2 of them, they assist victims in filing requests for these restraining orders. And again, those restraining orders are not attached to the criminal case. So if for whatever reason the criminal case isn't filed or if it's dismissed, those restraining orders can still remain. They're separate. The Victims Assistance Unit also refers victims to other agencies, for example, APS. If we ask APS to assist victims in cognitive evaluations, for example, or we use AAA, which is an agency that helps us quite a bit in helping victims get resources. One story I like to share is we had a victim who was in court, and our victim advocate realized that she couldn't hear anything that was going on. And so she was able to connect her with services to get a hearing aid, and that completely changed her life. That had nothing to do with the crime that was committed, but because our victim advocate spotted that and was able to step in and connect her with resources, we were able to help her get a hearing aid. Other agencies that we help connect victims with are behavioral health, Tri-Counties, and that is a non-exhaustive list. We work with a lot of different agencies. We're very grateful for their support. All right, so the penal code section that I mentioned earlier, it's referred to as elder abuse. This is a penal code section that was made specifically to protect elders and dependent adults. And before I get into it, one thing I want to delineate here is that the Welfare and Institutions Code, which is what controls for APS, they categorize elders as 60 and older, but the penal code remains unchanged. Under the penal code, elders are 65 and older. So it's a little bit different, and there's a little bit of a discrepancy there. And that only really affects us in terms of how we file cases. So this penal code section defines, again, an elder, someone who's 65 or older. It also defines a dependent adult. Essentially, a dependent adult is a person between the ages of 18 and 64 who has physical or mental limitations that restrict his or her ability to carry out normal activities or protect their rights. Essentially, somebody who has a disability and needs some assistance. They don't need to have a caregiver. They don't need to have any physical limitations, just any sort of limitation, physical or mental, that restrict their abilities. And just some examples, a developmental disability is one, diminished physical or mental capacities, such as being in a wheelchair, and also people who are in certain inpatient health facilities. All right, so I'm going to go through this penal code section a little bit, just so you understand how the legislatures have distinguished elder abuse. There's one subsection within this penal code really that highlights the reason and the need for this section. The subsection A talks about the legislative intent, and essentially what it says is that elderly victims and dependent adult victims are especially vulnerable, and they need extra protections, and that's what this law intends to do. The next subsection enumerates the crime of physical elder abuse or neglect, and this is the felony section. This is when somebody is injured to the point where they have a broken bone, for example, or they're neglected to the point where they're hospitalized, for example. The next subsection is unique because it expands the protections for these people. Generally, people are required to have some kind of injury, whether it's just pain or whether it's a broken bone, for us to file charges. But what the legislature has done for elder abuse is they've expanded that. The misdemeanor section for elder abuse also includes mental distress. So what that means is if an abuser is mentally abusing an elderly victim, that might be criminal. That might be a situation where we can file a crime. There may not be any injury that's visible beyond the mental distress that that victim is experiencing, and that is sufficient for us to file criminal charges and protect that person. The next subsection, actually, I'll talk about the next two together. These are essentially our two fraud sections, and this makes up a huge portion of my caseload. The reason being, one, elder fraud is extremely prominent. It's being reported a lot more frequently now than we've seen in the past. The other reason is that these two sections encompass a lot of different kinds of conduct. They encompass theft, embezzlement, even identity theft, forgery. And so I file a lot of cases involving different types of fraud against elderly people and dependent adults. There's even a section specific to false imprisonment of an elder, and there's a bunch of definitions within there. For example, it defines a caretaker, and there's another subsection in there, the last one I'm going to talk about, that enables elderly victims to get criminal protective orders, in other words, restraining orders. All right, moving on. So the next thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is how criminal cases get filed. A lot of people are unfamiliar with the system when they haven't been a part of the system. And it's a bit of a mystery to people how cases start with a report and they end up in a criminal case. And what we rely on to file a criminal case is for law enforcement to first take a crime report, to first conduct a thorough investigation and collect all the evidence, then submit that to me, to my office, to the other district attorneys in my office. We review that and we determine whether there is a case that we can file. So just taking a step back, procedurally, this is what happens. A crime is committed and it's either reported to Adult Protective Services or to the police. If it's reported to Adult Protective Services first, then we rely on a cross report. In other words, the social worker who responds will notify the police agency and let them know what's going on. At that point, we rely on our law enforcement partners to conduct an investigation, compile reports, and then the case is submitted to my office to review for possible filing of criminal charges. Just because a crime is committed doesn't necessarily mean that that will lead to criminal charges being filed. Let's see. And I'll talk about that a little bit later when I talk about some of the unique issues we see in elder abuse cases. Before I do that, though, one thing I'd like to highlight is when my office can assist before a case is filed. The one question we ask is, was there a police report filed? So sometimes we have victims calling in looking for assistance, and the main thing we need is for there to be a police report filed. If so, if the victim or the reporting party has spoken to law enforcement, then the victim advocates in our office and the Family Justice Center can assist. At that point, they can step in, they can meet with the victim, and they can look at providing services. Something else that is important to note is that assistance may be available even if we don't file a criminal case. All right. One question I get very often is, how can I help? What can I do if I know someone who's experiencing elder abuse? And what I recommend is report that crime to law enforcement, report it to APS. And while you're doing that, it's very important to collect all evidence of the crime. For example, photos, video surveillance, audio recordings, anything that corroborates, in other words, that supports the reporting party's summary of the crime, anything that demonstrates what happened independent of that person's recollection will help us in reviewing and filing cases. So we recommend people collect all documents, for example, power of attorney documents, bank records, medical records, phone records, any documentary evidence that corroborates or that supports that criminal conduct. It's also very important to make sure you have names and contact information of everybody involved. That way law enforcement can conduct thorough follow-up investigation if that needs to be done. Again, report the crime. And also consider making an appointment at our Family Justice Center. FJC stands for Family Justice Center. That might be an opportunity for the victim to look into requesting a restraining order before a criminal case is even considered. So earlier I mentioned common issues that we see in cases. Well, sometimes cases aren't filed because even though we believe a crime has occurred, we can't prove that case in court by the criminal burden of proof. And the burden of proof in a criminal case is beyond a reasonable doubt. That is the highest burden of proof in any courtroom, in any venue. And the issue with filing cases often is that there isn't enough corroboration. For example, many situations we see coming in are what we call he said, she said. Sometimes someone will report a crime. There won't be any injuries and there won't be any witnesses. And they speak to the abuser and the abuser denies it. Unfortunately, in many of those situations, we can't meet that burden of proof. We can't file a case because there isn't enough for us to prove that victim's version of events beyond a reasonable doubt. But in that same scenario, if there was prior abuse, if there was a witness to the incident, if there were injuries, any of these things might provide us corroboration that would help support that victim's version of events and reach that burden of proof. The other issue is that we see often is we need to prove every piece of that crime beyond a reasonable doubt. So for example, sometimes we aren't able to prove a defendant's intent. One example of this is theft. We need to prove for theft that somebody intended to take the victim's property either permanently or for an extended period of time. And if we can't prove that that's what that defendant intended to do, if there isn't enough evidence to show that that defendant wasn't borrowing the item, wasn't holding it for safekeeping, but rather that they intended to keep it permanently or for an extended period of time, ethically, we just can't file that case. Some other examples of things that we see specific to elder abuse cases. In fraud, very often, we can't prove that the victim did not consent to paying this person a little bit of overtime, extra overtime pay, just as an example. Another example, we can't prove that the victim lacked capacity to consent at the time and the defendant knew or reasonably should have known. So in other words, what I mean by this is sometimes elderly victims don't have the mental capacity to give meaningful consent. In other words, they are experiencing cognitive decline, they have dementia or Alzheimer's, and so any consent that they give is really invalid because they don't know the extent that they're consenting to. If that's the case, we need to be able to prove, meaning the prosecutors, we need to prove that the abuser, that the defendant either knew that that victim didn't have the ability to consent or they reasonably should have known. And this often leads to a mistake of fact defense. In other words, an abuser may say that they didn't know that this victim suffered from cognitive decline. They didn't know that the consent wasn't valid. We need to be able to overcome that with the evidence that we have. Something to highlight here is that the burden of proof is entirely on the prosecution. So we need to be able to prove every single piece of a case beyond a reasonable doubt. The defendant, the abuser, doesn't need to disprove anything. And so that's really the biggest issue in filing cases. Even if we believe something happened, we need to have enough proof to prove it in a criminal court. A couple other challenges we see, and I'll go through this one a little bit quickly. Defendants are less likely to remain in jail while cases are pending in lieu of bail. So there are some recent developments in the law that really are in support of giving defendants a chance to remain out of custody while cases are pending. And so very often we see abusers being released into the community, posting bail, and they go right back to their abuser, to the victim. And so this is really difficult for victims to understand sometimes when there are cases pending and the abusers are released pending resolution of that case, pending litigation of that case. Another issue we see very often is there's a huge backlog of cases from COVID. So sometimes we see cases from 2017, 2018 that are still pending because it's taking a long time to get through the backlog of cases. One issue we see is that a lot of victims, they don't want to come into the courthouse. They don't want to come in and testify. And unfortunately, there are some constitutional protections that defendants have that require that victims often come in and testify. When I say often, I don't mean that they come into court often. If a defendant wants to challenge a case, they don't want to plead guilty early on in the proceedings, then usually we will require a victim come in and testify because the defendant has a right to confront and cross-examine people who report crimes against them. Another issue is we see this very often in elder abuse among families. Victims sometimes become uncooperative with prosecution because they feel guilt, embarrassment, shame, or sympathy. This is very difficult in family dynamics, especially when the abusers are the victim's children. We see this very, very often as cases age, as they transpire. A lot of our elderly victims later become uncooperative. They start to blame themselves. They feel guilty for putting their children, their abusers, in the position that they're in, and they don't want to cooperate with prosecution anymore. I'll touch on this one very quickly as well. There's a lot of new legislation coming through, we've seen in the past couple of years, that really embrace mental health treatment, embrace giving first-time offenders a second chance. Actually, Carrie mentioned earlier the uptick in physical abuse cases that we're seeing. And I noted this. I think a lot of what we're seeing is a lot of people are experiencing the effects of untreated mental health conditions or mental health conditions that are becoming exacerbated over time. And often that leads to physical abuse. The legislation that we're seeing coming out now acknowledges that, and it encourages offenders to seek out mental health treatment. If they obtain that treatment, then they may earn dismissal of charges sometimes. There's also new legislation that reduces probation terms. So in the past, I think I'd say maybe about 2 years ago, probation terms were generally 3 years for felonies and a year for misdemeanors. And then in recent legislation, they've reduced that. One thing that the legislature has done is when there's a relationship between the parties, for example, when the abuser is the child and the victim is an elderly parent, that falls under an exception where the probation term is 3 years. And then the last challenge I'll discuss is sentencing. Another piece of legislation, this one's pretty old, is AB 109. And essentially what that says is because of overcrowding in jails, sentencing is revised unless someone has serious prior criminal convictions, and there's some other exceptions. Their sentence is essentially half of the stated sentence. So if they're given a 60-day jail sentence, they're only going to serve 30 days in jail, and they're going to get credit 2 days for every 1 actual day that they've been in. Okay. I'm going to jump back to our Victims Assistance Unit because I really want to highlight some of the things that our Victims Assistance Unit can do. One thing is we have our newest victim advocates, and their names are Star, Tracker, and Comet. These 3 dogs are incredible. These dogs are specifically trained to help victims through the process. Most people, when they hear about these dogs, they think they're specifically for children victims, but I've had these dogs assist on many of our cases. Just being in the courtroom with the elderly victims before they testify, or just having an opportunity for them to be in the room before someone testifies while they're talking about what happened, it really makes a big difference. And it also helps office morale to see them going up and down the hallways every day. All right, our victim advocates can also help refer victims to the Victim Compensation Board. The Victim Compensation Board is wonderful because it helps victims get restitution, in other words, get paid back for a lot of the expenses that they've incurred. While defendants are required to pay restitution, in other words, to pay for any damages that they've caused, any injuries, sometimes they can't afford to pay. And so the Victims Compensation Board is a great option for victims who need reimbursement for some of the expenses related to the crime. I also mentioned earlier our Family Justice Center. Our Family Justice Center is wonderful because not only can we help victims in applying for restraining orders, but we also connect victims to different agencies. For example, emergency assistance, safety services, shelter and housing assistance, mental health services. Our family justice centers are essentially one-stop shops for connections to all different kinds of resources within our community. So hopefully this helps give you a good overview of what the District Attorney's Office does, how we try and combat elder and dependent adult abuse within our community. And we're really grateful for the opportunity to talk to you today and share some of this information. All right, let's see if I can stop sharing.
Oh, I think I can do it. Yay,
Oh, great. Thank you.
Wonderful. Wow. Thank you so much to both of you. That was like packed full of such important information. And, working in this field, I certainly refer to Adult Protective Services and work with them and their social workers a lot. And just seeing this kind of other side of it and everything the Family Justice Center can do is really wonderful to know that all of that is there to support the victims in our county. Do we have if there's any questions in the audience, feel free to put them into the Q&A. Somebody did ask if we could share the slides, and we will do that. So I will go ahead and send an email to everybody that registered with a copy of the slides. And then once the recording is ready, I'll send a link to view that as well. So you can look this over again or share it with other people that you think need this important information. So I don't see any questions. So clearly you presented the information so well. Oh, wait, there comes one. Oh, this is a good one. How big of an issue are romantic scams with the senior population? I think either one of you could probably answer that.
I'll touch on it, and then Carrie can probably supplement that, because I'm sure that there's a lot of APS reports where these are initially reported. We do see a lot of that, unfortunately, and those kind of crimes are very difficult to combat, because firstly, we need to gain the victim's cooperation. We need to make them realize what's going on. I've seen a couple of situations where unfortunately victims are reluctant to accept that that's what's going on here. But when they're understanding and when they realize what's happening, at that point we can, well, not we, our law enforcement partners essentially, they conduct investigations involving search warrants, looking through electronic records, and usually they can track down who that person is. So long answer is, or I guess the short answer to that question is, they're very prevalent, and the long answer is they're really hard to prove, but with the victim's cooperation and with our law enforcement partners, we can sometimes file those cases.
I'll just add a little bit to what Alexa said. Everything she said is absolutely true. And we usually see probably one or two of those types of cases a month. And you know, this is true about scammers in general. They're really one step ahead. They've really evolved over the years. You know, they used to call from international numbers, then they got told not to do that. Then they started, you know, calling with United States numbers. Now they can just spoof local numbers so people answer the phone. So they've kind of figured out all the tricks of the trade, if you will, to kind of gain these people's trust. And one way that they do that, they often kind of impersonate people that it's hard to find them in person, like people working on an oil rig, or they impersonate military service personnel that are overseas. There's always a reason why they can't, you know, they can't meet in person, if you will. And so we've learned, we have a wonderful former FBI victim advocate, Debbie Deem. She currently runs our FAST team, our financial abuse specialist team, and she still will see victims of financial abuse for APS on the side, even though she's supposed to be retired. She says she's retired. I don't believe her, but she has kind of trained APS to, you know, try to Google search the image. And oftentimes you'll find it's a stock photo of the person. It's not a real picture. So, and it's not even, it may not even be the real gender of the person either. I mean, sometimes these are people sitting in a room, you know, on computers, and it's just, it's really like a cartel, like the mafia is the best way I can describe it. It's very evolved, and it's very structured and very organized, and it is tough for APS, and it's tough for law enforcement to combat it. And the clients just don't want to believe that it's a scam. A lot of the times, in terms of the folks that are most vulnerable to this, they're really younger clients, like in their 60s, maybe 70s, that are maybe recently widowed, and they're vulnerable because they're grieving the loss of their spouse, and they want that one last chance at love. They feel like, you know what, I've got maybe a third of my life left. I want to be with somebody. I want to have a meaningful relationship with somebody. So it's tough and it's challenging, like Alexa indicated, to get the clients to accept that they've been victimized. It really takes a long time to work with these victims. That's where people like the victim advocates and Debbie Deem come in, because they have a little bit more time to work with the victims to kind of, you know, get to gain their trust and rapport, and kind of break them out of the delusion, if you will.
Absolutely.
Just to add one thing, I just want to add, because Carrie made a really good point, and that's that these people are one step ahead of the victims. I was watching one of our victim advocates conduct a presentation, and she highlighted a situation where these scammers went online, found personal information about the victims that they were targeting, and in those phone calls and those emails, they would drop in those personal details. And unfortunately, those victims at that point were emotionally invested, because this couldn't be false. This person knows personal information about me. So they're very sophisticated.
Absolutely. You referenced Kelly Tyndall, who also works for the county there. And she did a presentation a month or two ago for us on common scams that target older adults, and that is available, the recording, on our website. And her biggest takeaway message was, don't answer the phone. Just don't answer the phone when you don't know the number. Really just not to trust, you know, to make sure that you verify everybody that's communicating with you.
Mhm.
And we have one final question. How often do you work together with outside private counsel in handling cases?
That's a good question. You know, we don't work with outside private counsel. Essentially, our client is the county. We represent the people of Ventura County, but we don't represent one particular victim. Even though there may be a named victim in our case, we're not necessarily their attorney. We are an attorney for the county. So there might be another case that is happening, a civil case, for example, where someone is suing someone else, a conservatorship case, a bankruptcy case, a different type of case that's pending where there are private attorneys involved. People hire their own attorneys to represent them. We don't necessarily work with them, but we sometimes are in communication with them. We'll share information. But the criminal case is essentially in its own bubble. It's its own world. And we operate independent of private attorneys.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Oh, did you have any
No, I
last
was going to
words?
say, for APS, confidentiality is often an issue. So oftentimes the client may not want us communicating with their attorney. So that's kind of what makes corresponding with outside counsel a little bit of a challenge for APS.
Got it. Well, I want to thank both of you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us. This has been so valuable, and I will send around the slides and the recording. And thank you to everybody that joined us today. Our legal seminar continues next month on August 8th. We will have a presentation about legal issues when caring for a loved one who has dementia. So if anybody is caring for someone with dementia or knows someone who is, that will be really important to watch that one. And you can go on our website and register at any time. And we just had a comment that says this was excellent and very informative. Thanks so much to Senior Concerns and the speakers. So thank you. I leave you with that. Have a wonderful afternoon. Stay cool. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.